take a look at maybe your church, and some of the early supporters may have, if the church is old enough, may have been supporting with money made from the slave trade.
Absolutely.
And slavery was legal in New England for over 200 years. And that's not part of the history that we're taught.
Hi, I'm Meg Sowens. I'm the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Medfield. And I'm really excited because today I'm going to be having a conversation with Constance and Dane Perry. And it's focused on a movie that they will be talking with you about. I want to have you remember, do you remember that we had a procession on December 14th, 2014, here in town? Probably there were 100 of us who walked from church to church to church to church, and we ended up at the gazebo. We were carrying candles, and at different churches we'd stop and we'd pray or we'd sing hymns. And the point was to demonstrate our support for Black Americans who face tremendous amount of injustice in the criminal justice system, among other places. We were marching in support of Black lives. The congregations that were involved in that procession and organizing that event have now gotten together, and we're going to be sponsoring a follow-up to that event on June 14th. It'll be at Church of the Advent. It'll start at 5:30. We're going to have pizza, and then we will begin with the program proper at 6 o'clock. Constance and Dane are going to be leading us that evening in watching the movie and having a conversation. So I'm really excited about the ability to follow up to our Black Lives Matter and to, as you put it, Dane, earlier, follow the umbilical cord back a little bit to discover more about how our country and our town even arrived in the place that we are now today. I'd like to invite you, let's start off by just telling me a little bit about who you are and what you're going to be doing that evening.
I'm Dane Perry. I was in a documentary film that was made or premiered in 2008 at the Sundance Film Festival. It was on PBS that summer, entitled Traces of the Trade. And what it does is it takes a look at my ancestral history. I'm a direct descendant of America's foremost slave traders. My ancestors brought more kidnapped Africans to the Western Hemisphere than any other family in American history. And Traces looks at that history in great depth. There's a lot of history in there that most Americans don't know. In fact, it was so important in the film that the film was nominated for an Emmy Award in historical research.
Wow.
But it connects that history with what we're going through today in our cities. What I refer to as the umbilical cord of slavery, others refer to it as the legacy of slavery, which is racism in America today.
And what about you, Constance?
I am a descendant of slaves from North Carolina and Virginia. And when we are in an audience and Dane has told his story about who he is and his connection to the family that the viewers of the film will be meeting in the film, I look out at the audience and I see heads looking at Dane and then looking at me and having this quizzical look on their face. And yes, I knew this history. And the interesting thing about it is not only is Dane a descendant of slave traders on one side of his family, he's a descendant of slave owners on the other side of his family from North Carolina and Virginia. And that's where my ancestors were from North Carolina and Virginia. So it's isn't it ironic that here we are together, traveling around the country, showing this film and having conversations about that history and the legacy of today, and the truth of that history that we hope will lead to reconciliation.
Truth and reconciliation, Two topics so intimately involved.
That's right. The truth will set you free, and not until we really grapple with the truth. And a lot of people say to us, why bring up this painful history? Why not just leave it alone? We bring it up because we have to deal with it. It's like an old sore. You have to take the scab off the sore sometimes for it to heal. And that can be painful, but it's healing. And going through this conversation as communities, which is what you all did last December. You made a statement as a community that we're all in this together, and that's what we are. We're all in it together, and we have to behave that way.
Right.
And the other thing is that the past isn't the past. And you talked in your opening comments about your community's involvement in Black Lives Matter movement that has taken off nationally since Ferguson.
Right.
And it's happening today. The legacy of the history of this country in terms of slave trading and slavery and Jim Crow and on and on, and we live it today. And the things that we're seeing in terms of lack of justice in our judicial system and many other systems we're living with today.
That's right.
And I think it's important to point out that after the film, we'll be having a conversation that the two of us will facilitate. And that conversation and that whole evening is not meant to be a time of placing blame or pointing fingers or feeling guilty. It's meant to be a time of looking back and understanding how we have gotten so terribly stuck where we are today.
Yeah.
This is not a situation, I believe, that we have created ourselves. It's a terrible legacy that's been handed down to those of us who came before us. And our job is to figure out how we can heal from it and move beyond it.
Right, right. Why don't you share with us a little bit about the movie itself? How did it, what prompted it to be made? How did that whole exploration begin?
A cousin by the name of Katrina Brown found this information out about our ancestors about 16 years ago, and she was rocked to the very bottom of her soul by it and felt that somehow she needed to do something very positive with this very negative information. So this young woman who had never made a movie before decided to make a documentary film examining that history and what it means for America today, hoping that she could deepen the national conversation on race.
She'd never made a movie, and it went all the way to Sundance?
That's right.
Amazing.
And PBS.
And PBS.
And PBS. And the two of us have shown it about 300 times around the country. Oh my
goodness, wow.
It's become a real calling for us.
And holding the conversations, helping people deepen their understanding once they've seen what's on the screen.
That's right.
History.
That's right.
And processing it after seeing the film is so critically important.
Yeah.
The family in the film, the family of 10 cousins, share their story as they travel from Bristol, Rhode Island, where the slave trading family lived, and with a film crew filming them along the way. And then they went to Ghana.
Okay.
And then Cuba, where the family owned plantations in Cuba, and then back to Bristol, all along being filmed and processing. What is this history? What is this history that for many they were learning about really for the first time, and grappling with that. And so people who are just regular everyday people, not actors, having those conversations. So now they had a chance in the film to tell their story. Okay. It invites the audience in a gentle way to also share their story and to have a conversation and to share their feelings, because we're all affected, whether you are African American or if you are white or person of color. And during the conversation, we make sure that the conversation is about all people of color, not just about African Americans and people who are white, because we're all affected by the I don't know, the sickness, the sickness of racism.
And how did you get involved in doing the, in holding the films and having conversations? When did that, what was it that pulled you to that, and how did that happen?
The first time I showed the film, we were just a couple. We had just started dating and by that point, living together. Yeah. And I was invited to show it at Trinity Church in Copley Square to a group of inner city kids there during a summer program. And I thought, sure, I'd love to. And at that point, we had a 20-minute trailer. That's all we had. This was in 2002. And I remember driving to Trinity thinking, who do I think I am going to this group of kids and showing this film and having this conversation?
Yeah.
And it ended up being a remarkable experience for me, for them. They were enthralled by it. And we suddenly realized we had something. That the film was one of 3 films that was selected by the high school students in Salt Lake City to be shown to them in a very, very large theater in Salt Lake City while we were at Sundance. And we realized then that we had lightning in a bottle with those kids, that the kids were entranced by it, deeply moved by it, and the conversation afterwards was way beyond any conversation we ever would have expected. And we find that continues to happen.
One of the, after Dane had shown the film maybe 2 or 3 times on his own, I wasn't there, and he said, why don't you come with me? And I sat in the audience.
And you at that point were saying, why would I want to go?
Exactly, why would I want to go? This is about a white family telling their story. This is your story. I know this history.
I don't need to be there.
I don't need to be there. This isn't my work. And so I went. After maybe the 2nd or 3rd time he showed the film, and I was sitting in the audience, and Dane would, after the film, would open the time up for questions, and and people would ask questions about how the film was made and things like that. And afterwards I said to Dane, why don't you ask them about how they felt about what they saw? And so we started the process of doing that, and I learned, because we started seeing, because we were doing this to mixed race audiences, that people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, didn't matter who was in the room, all had a story to tell. And I realized that this isn't just for white people to bear their soul. This raises a lot of deep, deep, deep emotion for people of color, for African Americans as well. There's a lot of deep emotion that we all carry, that we don't even acknowledge. We don't pay attention to. We're busy living our lives and dealing with things every day, and the pain of it is so deep that we just bury it. We bury it unless we're given the opportunity in a safe space, and we work to create a safe space regardless of where we show the film, whether it's in a school or corporation or a place of worship, in a safe space where people feel comfortable in sharing their story after having seen 10 people, non-actors, sharing their story. It's an invitation. What's your story? What's your memory?
And we're
Sounds
all
so powerful.
We're all deeply wounded by this racism. It's not just people of color. White people carry deep, deep wounds from it, and most of us don't realize it. The really complicated thing about this issue of race is those of us who are white, we don't know what we don't know. And it's not until we're able to share our stories with one another that we can begin to learn the real truth of the pain that people of color carry every day because of the slings and arrows they constantly endure.
People who come to see the film and participate in the conversation are hearing from people they've never seen before, or maybe it's a friend or a spouse or a partner who they've brought with them to the screening, and they will share a memory or a story. And sometimes it's for the first time that they're sharing it with anyone publicly. And the listeners are learning something about the other, and the person who's telling the story is also learning something about themselves, something more, something deeper. And many times people are anxious. Well, yes, I know we have racism here, but I don't know what to do about it. Or let's do something. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's do something. And we can't do the big something if we're not talking to each other, if we're talking across each other. One of the things that I like to say when we have a screening is every time there is an event, a national event, an event that has made the news, that has anything to do with race, there's a poll that's taken. And the poll question is something like, did this event, whatever the event is, have anything to do with race? The majority of people who answer the question who are white say no. And the majority of people who answer the question who are people of color say yes. Why? Why is there that gap? Why is there a divide? It's because we see and we experience life in a very different way. And so conversations that the film helps to draw people in begins to break down some of those walls and some of those misunderstandings, some of those barriers, so that we can have some common language, some common framework.
Can move forward in some way.
To move forward in some way.
But you can't move if you don't know where you are.
That's
No.
right.
You've
No.
got to figure out what's the ground
That's
that
right.
we stand on
That's
together.
Right.
That's
And it's
right.
that ground that we in New England have such misinformation about.
Tell us about that.
We remember ourselves as the great abolitionists. We were the
Yes.
ones who got rid of slavery.
Right.
Well, this is a New England story. The slave trade was based in New England. The first great wave of wealth in New England came from the slave trade. Ports from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Salem, Boston, Providence, New Haven, New York, all were deeply enmeshed in the slave trade. Harvard, Brown, Yale were all founded with slave money. You take a look at maybe your church, and some of the early supporters may have, if the church is old enough, may have been supporting with money made from the slave trade.
Absolutely.
And slavery was legal in New England for over 200 years. And that's not part of the history that we're taught.
Right.
And so it makes us feel we don't have any work to do up here in New England.
Right.
Down the south,
Southerners.
they've got the work to do. And when we go screen the film down there, after the film, they say, "Thank you for bringing up this
Yeah.
history." It's time people knew it.
And it also, I think, as an African American, I think it's important to have this conversation because we all have emotions related to this, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. But the other reason is there are so many people who are, I started to say people who are white who live in the United States, but I think even people of color who understand, who experience racism on a daily basis, but they don't, and they know a little bit about the history, but not maybe enough to understand the real true origins of it. We know that there was slave trading. We know there was slavery, but the impact of it, how did this country start? And who was it created for? It wasn't created for people who look like me.
Right.
And so the more that we all understand that history and really, really have an opportunity to grapple with the true history, then I think African Americans will stand taller because we contributed to the growth and development of this country in a very significant way. And that gets lost. That gets lost in that history that we don't talk about. And so we stand a little bit taller knowing that history. And I think people who are white begin to understand that when someone talks about the racism today, they understand it didn't start 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that it started with the founding of this nation. And it's like building a house where you start, you dig the foundation.
And then the sill.
That's right.
Right,
and
right.
it's just been building over time. Building over time. And so it's an education for all of us, an opportunity to learn from all of us.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that you're saying that I can't wait to learn more about is how important it was at the beginning of the founding of the nation, and how much of the money that actually, you said, into Harvard and Brown, how much of the money that was at the basis of this economy, sounds like came from the slave trade in the North.
That's right. And then the second great wave of wealth in New England came from the mills in Lowell and Lawrence and Fall River and New Bedford. The cotton came from where? It came from the backs of slaves down south. And so New England was deeply immersed in this. And slavery, even though the word is never used, slavery, the slave trade, was written into our founding documents. And again, this is not to point fingers or place blame or feel guilty. It's about learning how we've gotten so stuck today and how we can move. So we're looking back in order to look forward in a more healthy way.
Right, and to peel off some blinders that we actually see what we've done, what has happened here.
That's right.
What has happened here.
There's a quote that I refer to before we have the conversation from Kierkegaard, who was a philosopher and a theologian. And the quote is, "We live our life by going forward, but we understand our life by looking back." And
that's beautiful.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
So we need to understand why we are where we are today, even though it's 2015, we have an African American president, and yet when we see the racism, as Dane said, it's the scab, it's the layers that have never gone away. Have never gone away. There are things that we do. It's like we put a Band-Aid on it. We have civil rights movement, and thank goodness we had it, that changed the laws. But what about the hearts of people? What about the minds of people? And for everybody who was involved in the civil rights movement across the board, they had dedicated years of their life. It wasn't a few months here and there, years of their life fighting for civil rights. And then when we finally got voting rights and civil rights, people went home. They raised their families.
Yeah, that's done.
That's done. And lived their life. And in the meantime, we papered over things that were happening still.
Right.
And we passed laws in our adult lifetimes that have been horribly discriminatory against people of color, our drug laws.
Right.
And as a result, massive, untold numbers of African Americans and Hispanic people have been going to prisons,
Right.
which we have now turned into many profit-making organizations
Oh, I know.
that have to be filled in order to make the profit, and that is systemic racism that's taking place there. And until we realize the true implications of the decisions that we're making, and where those decisions came from, we're never going to be
Right.
the land that our founding documents say that we are.
Yeah. I mean, we have to learn about the past, we have to understand where we come from, and we have to be able to see today. And that's the conversation, you know, with Michelle Alexander's book
right.
That's
about
right.
the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration.
That's right.
But it's, but I think she has a metaphor that she uses about a poison that keeps reinventing itself. But but you have to keep vigilant and look.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
understand what the past is, and then look around for what's going on now.
Exactly.
Because it's without our even being aware that we've done this.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, for a lot of white people, I mean.
That's right. That's right. People of color know it.
Yeah, people of color
They know it.
It's
And so many of us with skin looking like mine
yeah,
have a real hard time understanding that. And Constance had said this earlier. Our life experiences are so different that we have different worldviews. And because our worldviews are so different, we're like this. And that's what we hope this conversation after the film can help bridge some of that very, very bad gap of misunderstanding.
well, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful goal, and I'm so glad that you're going to be coming and you're going to be showing the film and helping us have that conversation afterwards, so that we can bridge some of those gaps, so that we can end up in the same understanding the same basic facts about the world that we're part of. Is there something else you'd like to, share with us about your hopes for the evening, or any other thoughts, anything that you'd like to leave us with?
We hope it will be a positive experience for people, that they will be glad they came. And we're looking forward to it very much.
We did a screening a while back in the Midwest at a corporation, and who invited people from the community as well as people from this particular corporation. And at the end of the film, an African American man who was very active in the community, been involved in lots of civil rights activities and justice issues for a lot of his life, said, "I have been to more conversations around race than I would really like to remember at this point." The numbers, I've lost track of the numbers. And most of the time I leave feeling awful, and I feel like, we weren't listening to each other, people were talking over each other, and what's the point? This is the first time that I have participated in a conversation like this where I don't feel that way. I really am leaving here feeling like, across the board, people of color and people who are white, because I heard people who I know who are white who are here, as well as other people of color, who said, somehow we had a fruitful conversation, a difficult conversation, but a conversation that I think will help move us from where we were to another place where we can continue to build on this and continue to have the conversation. So we hope that people will come and bring family, bring friends, participate in the conversation. And this is the work we have to do together.
And we hope there'll be lots of students there. We go to many high schools, even middle schools. And this is a conversation for our kids to participate in also.
Right. It's not just for us,
Yeah.
older
no.
folks.
Oh, no.
The sooner we have the conversation, the better, right?
And we've got some things we can learn from them.
Good. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Well,
And I'm
thank
really
you. Looking forward to
Looking
it.
forward to it. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
This program was made possible through the generous support of your Medfield friends and neighbors, folks just like you. And thanks for watching.